Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wale Adelbamwe. I'm the director of the Center for Africana Studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's talk as we resume our Africana Classics lecture series. This series invites us to return to foundational texts in Africana Studies, works that not only illuminate the past, but also press us to reflect about the present and the future. Today, we are honored to have Professor Herman Beavers to lead us in a discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved, a novel that continues to shape conversations about history, memory, resistance, and Black life. Professor Beavers is the Julie Beren Platt and Mark E. Platt President's Distinguished Professor of English and Africana Studies here at Penn, where he has taught African American literature and creative writing since 1989, just a year after I was born. A scholar and poet, he has published widely on African American literature, jazz, and Southern modernism. His books include Wrestling Angels into Song and Geography and the Political Imaginary in the novels of Toni Morrison, as well as poetry collections such as Obsidian Blues and Vinyl Poems. He has also co-edited Approaches to Teaching and J. Gaines's The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Professor Beavers' leadership extends far beyond the classroom. He was recently elected to serve as second vice president of the Modern Language Association, with his term as first vice president beginning this year. His service has also included extensive work on diversity, very interesting work in this age, curriculum development and community engagement in education. Professor Beavers teaches with Professor Susan Berger, the arts-based community service course entitled August Wilson and Beyond, which brings Penn students together with West Philadelphia residents to read August Wilson's Century Circle of Plays. Among his many honors, he has been recognized with the Judith Rodin Education Award and the Randy Martin Spirit Award from the Imagining American Consortium. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beavers as he gives us.
Walk up to the mic. Thank you for that introduction, but I'm not going to be at the mic. I'm going to be over here because I'd like to walk around. Thank you all for coming out. In particular, I want to recognize two members of last year's August Wilson and Beyond class, Mr. John, who, for reasons that escape me, decided they want more punishment. You know you're not going to get this time back, right? So to dive in, I have a PowerPoint, but to dive in, I want to cite something that Toni Morrison said when someone asked her why she wrote Beloved, and she says this: "There is no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of or recollect the absences of slaves. There's no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist, the book had to." So those of you who have, let me ask, how many of you have read Beloved? Like most of the room. Good. So you'll remember that Beloved starts with a dedication, 60 million and more. And I've pondered what Morrison meant by that over the years, and I particularly had the opportunity to do it in teaching my class, Toni Morrison and the Adventure of the 21st Century. But toward the end of the novel, Morrison says this: "Freeing yourself was one thing, claiming responsibility for that freed self was another." In many ways, one can think about that statement as being everything that dealing with slavery involves. Is that it's not just enough to get out from under the onerous burden of slavery. you also have to figure out how to have a life beyond that. So a lot of people think about Beloved as a novel of trauma, and I will say that I am myself prone to think of it that way, but I think it's a lot more. And so one of the things that I would say is that I don't think of Beloved as a novel about slavery. I think about Beloved as a novel about the afterlife of slavery. Because we have flashbacks to Sweet Home, but by and large, what happens in the book happens in Setha's house. So there's this moment at the end of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, his first one written in 1845, where he says, describes his first time standing up in front of a group of white people at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And he says, the truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of talking to white people weighed me down. It's a pretty powerful statement, because we know from Douglass's history that he goes on for the latter portion of the 19th century to be one of the most important people of the century, certainly one of the most visible Black people of the 19th century. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, you can. But when we compare Frederick Douglass, because it just be like this. This technology. When we compare Setha to Frederick Douglass, Setha, outside of the people in Cincinnati who live near her, she's not going to be a national figure unless we think about Margaret Garner, the woman that Setha is based on, who was written up in the newspapers after she murdered one of her children. So Morrison talks about finding this clipping when she edited the Black Book, when she was still an editor at Random House. So one of the things that I want to talk about, and I'm more interested in the conversation. So what I'm going to get to are questions, and so many people have read the book. We can actually spend time talking about it. But I want to frame the discussion in this way. So when I think about that 60 million and more epigraph, we could certainly think about it as a rumination on the Middle Passage. We don't have great numbers on how many Africans were captured and brought to the New World. But some people put the number in the millions and in the tens of millions. But I think that 60 million and more also might mean that if we move forward in time from the period of enslavement, that the body count is actually rising. Because one of the things that runs through all of Toni Morrison's books is that she's very critical of the idea that the rage that we feel under white supremacy, we often turn that rage in on ourselves, which explains some of the violence that happens in Black communities. And Beloved, and I think her books post Beloved, are a way to ruminate on how do we avoid doing that? How do we avoid turning that rage in on ourselves and aiming it at the people that we love or the people that live in proximity to us? How do we do that? For her, that's a conundrum that Black people continue to wrestle with. So one of the things that I think she's also very prescient about is the fact that she sees serious limitations for African Americans if they become wedded to the idea that their identity is synonymous with suffering. Now, we have all kind of reasons to know that that's not true. If you just look at African-American music and African-American expressive culture, clearly suffering is not what's driving that. But there are a lot of people that think that it is. And so you think about somebody like Larry Elder saying that the reason why we don't want to teach African-American history is that it makes Black students think that they're victims. It makes my top 10 for one of the most stupid things that you could say. It's about number 5. The other 4 are occupied by somebody whose name I won't mention. But unlike Toni K. Bambara, who in a novel that she published in 1980 called The Salt Eaters, really tried to think about what we need to do to find the power and agency that will free us from the kind of traumas that we suffer with. The novel, The Salt Eater, starts with the words, "Sweetheart, are you sure that you want to be well?" Very powerful words. And the book is set in a psychiatric hospital and a community clinic where the whole novel is basically the sort of exorcism of Velma Henry's demons, which is then told to us in flashback. But here's the thing. In the first chapter, as you know, Seth and Paul D have a romantic encounter that seems to be the answer for both their longing and their loss. But in the next chapter, the very next chapter, Morrison collapses the encounter in on itself. Lying next to one another, they look at each other and they feel nothing but disappointment. And a sense of shame, even. Setha covers herself up. So much of what is at issue in this book has to do with the notion of coherence and personal coherence that people are trying to mount when they're caught in a chaotic state. So if you think back to that scene with actually, why don't I go forward? Fugitive Slave Act. If you think about that scene in the clearing, let me just jump to it right here and then we'll go back. It's page 162 in the book. Now, to take 2 buckets of blackberries and make 10, maybe 12 pies, to have turkey enough for the whole town pretty near, new peas in September, fresh cream but no cow, ice and sugar, batter bread, bread pudding, raised bread, shortbread, it made them mad. Loaves and fishes were his powers. They did not belong to an ex-slave who had probably never carried 100 pounds to the scale or picked okra with a baby on her back, who had never been lashed by a 10-year-old white boy, as God knows they had, who had not even escaped slavery, had in fact been brought out of it by a doting son and driven to the Ohio River in a wagon, free papers folded between her breasts, driven by the very man who had been her master, who also paid a resettlement fee, name of Garner, and rented a house with 2 floors and a well from the Bodwins, the white brother and sister who gave stamp paid Ella and John clothes, goods, and gear for runaways because they hated slavery worse than slaves. So that moment of the feast, they're feeling undone and they seek to punish Setha for her pride. They find coherence by first not warning her that school teacher is on his way to 124 Bluestone Road. And then they judge her for killing her child. So really, I can teacher's voice. So really, one of the things about this book that really interests me is that moment when Setha decides to murder her children, and only successfully murders one, is that Setha is pushed into what I call a space of radical autonomy, where she's cut off from the community. Had the mechanisms that bind this community had been working, the mechanisms had been working, somebody would have come and warned Setha that school people, these strange looking men were in town and they needed to be aware, but that doesn't happen. So one of the things about this book is that the rest of the novel is really sort of attempting to unravel this choice. And the community, rather than adopting the New Testament ethos of love and forgiveness, they adopt an Old Testament ethos of an eye for an eye, get what you get, you get what you deserve. And by virtue of that, we are kind of in a stalemate for the entire book, because what would liberate everyone is to tell the story of what happened and why it happened. But that doesn't really happen. And so one of the ways that I want to sort of metaphorize what's going on in this book, thank you, is that Morrison, let me see if I can mute the screen. Can I do that? No. One of the metaphors that I use in this book, if you think about the idea of a short circuit, a short circuit happens when an electric appliance is wired in such a way that the wiring goes bad and the circuit can't be completed. And so what happens is sparks jump from one side of the gas to the other. It means the appliance might work, but generally what happens is that and so what we have in this book are a series of sort of short circuits where the communication apparatus can't work because it's short-circuited by a variety. Short-circuited by trauma, it's short-circuited by pride, it's short-circuited by rage, it's short-circuited by racism and white supremacy. And so when you think about that, this moment right before school teacher arrives, and he arrives the next day, one of the things that happens is that people fall back on their own experience as slaves as a way to interpret what the feast and their critique of the feast means. So instead of thinking about this in the way that they do in the clearing, Baby Suggs saying that, we have to love ourselves and we have this about flesh and we need to, she literally helps people learn how to restore the link between the Black interior, as Elizabeth Alexander might call it, and the Black exterior, which she calls flesh. But here, when somebody says, she's never picked up 100 pounds, put her on a scale. She's never been whipped by a 10-year-old white boy. What authority does she have to convene us to have this feast? Now, one of the things that we know is that Black folks can be very hard on one another. There's probably some Black person right now that's mad about something that they're seeing because they don't think that it adequately represents their preference. But Baby Suggs has taught them that, because she has people laugh, that's crying, she has people dancing, and it all gets mixed up. So she's literally helping people restore their emotional matrix in the right way, and it all goes to hell when she has. So if we go forward, too much they thought. Where does she get it all, Baby Suggs holy? Why is she and hers always the center of things? How she always knows exactly what to do and when, giving advice, passing messages, healing the sick, hiding fugitives, loving, cooking, loving, preaching, singing, dancing, and loving everybody like it was her job and hers alone. So what we have is a breakdown. And when Setha finally narrates what happens, Paul D says to her, what you did was wrong, Seth. You got 2 feet, Setha, not 4. If you look at the exchange that leads up to that, Setha says, I stopped him, she said, staring at the piece as a place where the fence used to be. I took my babies where they would sing. Your love is too thick, he said, thinking, that bitch is looking at me. She is right over my head, looking through the floor at me. Too thick, she said, thinking of the clearing where Baby Suggs commands knock the pods out porch chestnuts. Love is or it ain't. Thin love ain't love at all. Yeah, it didn't work, did it? Did it work, he asked. It worked, she said. How? Your boy's gone, you don't know where. One girl dead, the other one leave the yard. How did it work? They ain't at Sweet Home. School teacher ain't got them. Maybe there's worse. It ain't my job to know what's worse. It's my job to know what is and to keep them away from what I know is terrible. I did that. So let's ruminate on that for a second. And because I want this to be a conversation, is there merit to what Setha is saying? And silences don't bother me. I'll just wait out. And I recognize some people haven't read the book, but we got an interesting exchange here that ends with Paul D saying to Setha, you got 2 feet, Setha, you don't have 4. In other words, you're not an animal. What you did might have been instinctive. Where's the thought behind it, and did it work? Is what he asked her. So is there merit to what Setha is saying, given what we might call the maternal instinct to protect our children? Particularly in a moment where this man is at her house to take her children back into the sleep.
So
Yeah.
Is it that the teeth of the slaw are much less damaging than the teeth of snake? That's her maternal instinct.
And there's more, right? Which is that Denver is literally nearby in her arms. She doesn't kill Denver. She kills the older child who's like walking and crawling. And I've always sort of wrestled with why didn't Setha kill Denver first? Now I know that sounds pretty macabre, but I'm saying that because Denver is the only one of her children that wasn't born in slavery. She's born on the way to 124 Sweet Home, literally on the river, the boundary between slave state and free Ohio. But in the end, you're right that it's worse. Setha cannot imagine her children going back to slavery after they've been free. So there's some logic to it, but what Beloved asks us to think about is when we act instinctively, do we have to deal with the consequences of acting instinctively?
She also did not kill the 2 older sons.
No, she tried though, because she hit him in the head with a flat of an axe, but they survived, and they're afraid of her for the rest of the time that they're at 124 Bluestone Road. So just jump to my questions. I'd rather have a conversation. At the end of the book, and I'm going to be jumping around. At the end of the book, Morrison writes, this is page 323 and 324, it was not a story to pass on. And then shortly thereafter, we get a variation, this is not a story to pass on. So 2 things. One, I'm interested in Morrison's shift from the past tense to present tense, but I'm also interested in what the implication of what she's saying. Is what happened at 124 Bluestone Road, is that not a story that we should pass on, that we should tell? At this house, this woman murdered her baby, keep the baby from being taken back into slavery. But we're not gonna tell that story. When she shifts to the present tense, this is not a story to pass. Why the shift? And Morrison doesn't do anything without having a reason for doing it. So why shift from this was not a story to pass on to this is not a story to pass on?
I wonder if it gives her agency. She gets to tell the story of the events, that's not the story that I want it to be, and I get to own this,
I like that. And one thing that I would sort of add to that is perhaps when reading it wrong, perhaps the real statement she's making is this is not a story to pass on. you have to engage this story. So if we think about our present moment where they're literally shunting African American history into the dustbin of history, we are electing to pass on what is really important information, all because we worry about white children feeling bad about themselves because they're having to read about slavery. Now, they when I was in third grade, my teacher, Miss O'Brien, said, on the day after Lincoln's birthday, I think, slavery was not that bad. It gave black people purpose, and Lincoln, and she looked directly at me, and Lincoln freed the slaves. So part of what we got to contend with is the sort of heroic narrative that people want to implant or replace or restore, where black people have no agency. Because my reading of history is that black people freed themselves. I'm not saying that the Emancipation Proclamation is not important, but black people were resisting slavery the entire time. So I'm bothered by the manner in which somebody says, "Well, this is not a story to pass on." But again, is the sense of double entendre, right? Is it that this is not a story to pass on, but this is not a story that you should avoid either listening to or telling. So here's my question. What is the danger in silence as Morrison describes it in this book? And on page 137, 138, she describes Paul D having this little tobacco tin that he puts all of his traumatic memories into, never to deal with them. Or we got Setha's notion of remembering. So what we get, if I go forward, this is Setha. So we go back. So these are three versions of Setha's choice. This is from school teacher's point of view. Right off, it was clear to school teacher especially that there was nothing there to clean. The three, now four, because she had the one coming when she cut pickaninnies they hoped were alive and well enough to take back and raise properly to do the work Sweet Home desperately needed, were not. Two were lying open-eyed in sawdust. Third pumped blood down the dress of the main one. The woman school teacher bragged about. The one he said made fine ink. Damn good suit, pressed his collars the way he liked, besides having at least 10 breeding years left. But she's gone wild due to the mishandling of the nephew who overbeat her and made her cut and run. School teacher had chastised the nephew, telling him, just think, what would his own horse do if you beat it beyond the point of education? So that's school teachers' take on what is happening. This is Stampede's take. So Stampede is with Paul D, and we get this. So Stampede did not tell him how she flew, snatching up her children like a hawk on the wing, how her face beat, how her hands worked like claws, how she collected them every which way, one on her shoulder, one under her arm, one by the hand, the other shouted forward into the woodshed, filled with just sunlight and shavings now because there wasn't any wood. The party had used it all, which is why he was chopping some. Nothing was in that shed he knew, having been there early that morning. Nothing but sunlight. Sunlight, shavings, a shovel. The axe he himself took out. Nothing else was in there except the shovel and, of course, the saw. And then this is Seth's take. We was here, each and every one of my babies and me too. I birthed them and I got them out, and it wasn't no accident. I did that. I had help, of course, lots of that, but it was me going it. going at it, me saying go on and now, me having to look out, me using my own head, but it was more than that. It was a kind of selfishness I never knew nothing about before. It felt good, good and right. I was big, Paul, being deep and wide. And when I stretched out my arm, all my children could get in between. I was that wide. Looked like I loved them more after I got here. Or maybe I could love them proper in Kentucky because I could love them proper in Kentucky because they weren't mine to love. But when I got here, when I jumped down off that wagon, there wasn't nobody in the world I couldn't love if I wanted to. The key word is selfishness. So people, scholars have grappled about this. Is Seth's act the selfish one? But look at the way that she describes it. She describes it in the terms of her own agency, not a collective act, not I wanted to spare them. Me having to look out, me using my own word, my own head. It was a kind of selfishness I never knew nothing about before. So what is that saying about slavery that life in Ohio can be contrasted to? It was a kind of selfishness I never knew nothing about before. It felt good.
She owned herself. She wasn't someone else's property that she was the self for the first time.
So, other thoughts? Don't make reference yet. Yes.
Look at motherhood as the ultimate selfishness in a lot.
Yes. Yes, say more.
Well, mother and smothering, over mothering, and then you look at this system that's smothering, not letting people have their own say. Like you didn't ask to come into this. Same thing, slave. You didn't ask to be a slave, but that's what you want. So.
And look at Baby Suggs, right? Baby Suggs has 7 children, and the only one that that is able to keep is Hallie. All the rest of them are sold away to the point where she has the last child. She doesn't even look at the child because they're going to take it away from her and sell it. So yeah, I think you're right that selfishness does play a part in this because you get to hold to yourself something that you don't expect to be able to hold to yourself. So one of the things about this book, and people refer to Beloved, the entity, as Setha's daughter. And I want to, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, I want to dispel that notion. The entity that has come to 124 Bluestone Road is not Setha's murdered child. If you think back to the book, the entity comes out of the water fully clothed, and she makes her way to 124 Bluestone Road. And when Setha sees her, what happens? She walks up on the child. She and Denver walk up on the child, and I think maybe Paul D. What happens? You remember? She voids her ladder. Now, this book, water is a very important symbol, but what I want to say is that part of what this book grapples with is the idea of scale. If you think about the Middle Passage and the African slave trade, that's a product of the global economy. You think about what happens in the novel at 124 Bluestone Road, that's local. But one of the things that I would say is that the reason why Setha and Beloved have this codependent relationship where they're literally, where Setha's literally being drained of her life force, is because they both desperately want for each other to be the person that they need them to be. Setha needs for the entity to be her murdered child, but Beloved needs for Setha to be a woman that the child that she was during the Middle Passage bonded with during the Middle Passage who died during the voyage. So if you go to the novel and you read that experimental section, Beloved says, I'm looking for the joined. So that says a couple things. One, that she's probably a very small child, and that when she saw the face of this woman next to her, she bonded with her. But the woman died en route and she was taken away. And so think about what happens to a child that's bonding with its mother and then the mother is taken away. That's very serious psychological trauma. So I want to say that Beloved, the entity, is actually Black people's collective grief going back to the Middle Passage. So that quote that Toni Morrison offered at the start of the talking about why she wrote Beloved, the Toni Morrison Society has taken to placing what they call benches by the road. And at this point, there are probably about 30 or 32 benches at various places. So I was at the placing of the first bench in Charleston, South Carolina, where they placed the bench at the pier where they offloaded African captives to be sold into slavery. So literally at the place that the majority of Black people coming from West African coast to the north, what would have then been British North America, the bench is there. But you know, the thing that I want to ask you guys about, this is not a story to pass on, but one of the things that we do in our culture to commemorate historical events is that we create memorials. So let me ask you the question. Would we be better served by a memorial on the order of the King Memorial in Washington or the Vietnam Memorial in Washington that has all the names of the dead? Would we be better served by that as opposed to a novel about the afterlife of slavery? Yeah.
Well, I think they're completely different things. I think a novel has a life that is transferred from the writer into the story that lives there. And then the reader of that novel takes it inside of them, which is, I think, quite different because it has an emotional life. It has a timbre, it has a language. It has all of these qualities that a memorial is, I don't want to say it's a one and done because that's not true, but it's static. A narrative is not static, it will live on.
Well, I think what you say has a lot of merit, but has anybody here been to the Vietnam Memorial?
I have.
So the first time I went, I thought exactly what you thought, which is that it's static and how can this in any way capture the atrocities and the horror that was Vietnam. When I got there, I saw a kid who could not have been more than 13, and he was standing at the wall and put his head on the wall and he just wept. And people were leaving flowers and other sort of mementos. So I would not say that it's static. I would say that people were interacting with it. Because even the choice by the architect who designed it, even the fact that her design was chosen when what they really wanted was statues of soldiers, which there is. You look to the right of the memorial, there are statues of 3 or 4 soldiers. But it is very interactive. It was interactive for me because there was a guy that grew up in my hometown who died in Vietnam, and it became really an imperative for me to find his name. Terry Purple. So one of the things that memorials do, because you're not wrong about the novel. The novel is a piece of cultural technology that allows us to go back and forward in time. It's a remarkable human invention when you think about how early in human history the novel appears. And the fact that by the time we get to a novel like Don Quixote, it's doing amazing things and it moves forward from there. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just asking the question because literacy is not something that we should assume. It could be that a memorial is a better way for somebody that whose life is not arranged around books to deal with collective trauma. So I ask the question again, is memorial or not? Now, this is my class. I make y'all get up. I make y'all and we argue. Yes, definitely.
I would say the book is more far reaching because this is about everyone in this room read the book or know about the book. But I don't know how many people have been to the memorial or go to the memorial. I just say far reaching.
Well, and the memorial doesn't exist. So that's the other problem. It doesn't exist. We'd have in this political climate that ain't getting that right. I mean, I only 47.
Right.
47 talks about Frederick Douglass in the present tense. So that tells you everything we need to know about the climate.
Yeah, this might be a cop-out, but I think it's less of a question of memorial or novel and more of a question of, or more of an emphasis on like critical engagement and like deep reading, deep sitting with something. So yes, this 10-year-old was able to engage with the memorial and see it clearly and really feel, but only because he chose to engage with it that way versus someone who's just walking by and maybe reads the title but maybe doesn't. So when we go back to like this is not a story to pass on, I'm also thinking about what you were talking about with like the sort of breakdown in communication that happens in the novel with that circuit. Like we are, even if it does get resolved through community in the end, we are taught to question communication because it's human and people can choose to be selfish and choose to be petty and choose to, not tell their neighbor that school teacher is coming. So I'm not sure if quick communication is reliable, all of that to say. Morrison takes this little news clipping and extends it into a whole novel, and we're still wrestling with it. So I'm not even sure if like extended communication
Actually, a novel and a opera.
exactly is reliable. So yeah, I'm thinking about that. I'm also thinking of like just the potential misreading that can happen with like memorialization or with like representation, because like Paul D, and when he has the bit in his mouth, that's the silencing. So there's no speech, there's no communication at the level of like speech there, but certainly like him on his hands and knees with the bit in his mouth is saying everything that's it saying what he wants it to say. So yeah, I don't know.
Yes, here. And then I saw a hand up over.
I find it very complicated and blurred because I would also consider how like a cultural artifact, whether a memorial novel is linked to power or not. And for example, like I'm from the global south, so like that's a memorial for Vietnam. I read it as a very imperialistic gesture of America conquering the rest of the course on the countries. So what I understand, what for some people that might be a very touching thing about like the people they lost, I take it no. I mean, this is like a imperial symbol. Well, I don't know, like in the case of certain novels, I find that some authors, they really question not only a context, but also their own voice or like from where they are standing. And I think that's something, I guess, Morrison does good. Like, because you mentioned the thing of the scale, like the local and the global a moment ago, and I think it's a matter of how you see those blind spots. I don't know, what about the memorial, especially if it's sponsored by a government,
Yes.
Oh, hi. So when I think of like other memorials, like I went to the Whitney Plantation, and just those visuals there, like it really helped me to confront, I think, generational trauma that I didn't realize I had as a descendant of slavery. And then other memorials of pilgrimages to Ghana or Vida or Warrior Island. It's very, it is traumatizing, but it's also an healing. So ideally, I don't know if I would want to make a choice, but if you to push me in a direction, I think the visual engagement or just having some place to physically mourn, not even my own, grief of the transatlantic slave trade, but mourning, inherited grief, generational grief. I think it has a healing component that I didn't realize I had.
That's a really important formulation. Thank you for that. Because maybe it's both and. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not either or. Maybe it's both and. Now, what it means, if that's the case, is that we have to, as a community, figure out how to muster the political capital and the actual capital to make a memorial happen. But it could be that that's a great exercise for us to undertake. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why did we have to pick? Because
Right.
but also, I think we have to do it ourselves. Because of the guilt or shame or whatever it is that makes white folks uncomfortable. And I think we did that with the memorial at the legacy, which is a little different because it's the names of it's family names, right? But you can also go in and punch in your information,
right?
And find that. But in a sense, we did that ourselves.
Right. So I'm looking at my watch. Are there questions about the book that you had? Yes.
For context, I did not read the book, so no questions from oranges. But I have a question about the idea of like selfishness. But you at the beginning mentioned, and also Ashley mentioned the idea of the lack of community or the lack of like forewarning for school teachers. And as someone who did not read the book, I'm wrestling with the idea of focusing on selfishness, but I'm wondering like who was selfish first and what was the content and leading up of the lack of community, which led to this also like secondary like trauma of children. I'm wondering about lead up to that.
Well, Paul Garner, who owns SEPA and Baby Suggs and Sweet Home Men, he says on page 12, y'all got boys, picky boys, stropping boys. My niggas is men. Bought them that way, raised them that way, men every one. And as that scene goes on, the white slaveholders he's talking to say, well, I wouldn't have no nigga man around my wife. And Garner says, neither would I, and it leads to a fist fight. Now he's saying a bunch of stuff. One of the things he's saying is that these slaveholders who have boys for slaves are pedophiles. It's a really nasty thing to say, but in the end, it's white men battling over masculinity. It's not because he's conferring masculinity on the Sweet Home. Now, that scene in the book is actually a rewriting of a scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin where these slaveholders are talking about how they treat their slaves. And one of the things that they say is, you treat them like men, they won't run away. They'll come, you send them off to do some task and they'll come back with all the money. But if you don't treat them like men, so Morrison takes that scene in Stowe, which is very brief, and she expands that because over the course of the novel, what Paul D. wrestles with is that if it weren't for Paul Garner, I would not even have manhood. And the proof of that is there's Paul D. Garner, Paul F. Garner, and Paul A. Garner. And when I teach Beloved, I have my students look at those names and I say, well, what is amiss about those names? And what students, it took me years to realize this. What is missing is that there's no period behind the D or the F or the A. Which means what? When we put a period behind in someone's name behind a capital letter, what does that mean? If you're Paul D. Garner, there's a period behind the D. It's your middle name. That's not what he's doing. All he's doing is distinguishing between his property So, you look at that, I've been teaching this novel since 1988. And I just realized it like 3 years ago, like, oh, wait. Which is to say this is the novel. The reason why we write novels because they keep on. Yeah. That's why. I read Toni Morrison. I'm like, how did I miss that? So it's for me, it's I love talking about Beloved because every time I look back at it, I see stuff that I did see. Other questions? And I know we're kind of winding down, but I'll hang around for those who have questions who are too shy to ask them in the audience. Other questions about the book?
Have you seen different ways that it's been received in the years that you were teaching?
Yeah, it's the most banned book in school systems in the United States. Which raises some questions because the first time I read about it being banned was in Ohio. And the woman who was the head of the school board in the district that banned it said, who wants to read a novel in which there's infanticide and violence? No, that says to me she didn't read the book because there's a whole lot of other things that happen in the book. But it's an easy book it's an easy target because Morrison doesn't shrink away from representing what the experience is. At the same time, Tyrone, can I play that clip? He's asking her if she will ever write about something other than
I
this.
think, I answered the question he didn't pose. Tolstoy writes about it all the time. So does Zola, so does James Joyce. Now, if anybody can go up to an imaginary thing and say, you write about race all the time. It's centrally in my whole. When are you going to write about what? Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also race. So to ask me when am I going to stop, or if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about Black people. Anything can happen at all. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. In this book, I did.
She's referring to Mercy.
What was insulting? The idea that you felt like you had to prove that you could write without.
Yeah, the question was posed as though it were a desirable thing to do, to write about white people or to write not about race. That's what that means.
Right.
And that it was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important, and that I was still writing about marginal people, and why don't I come into the mainstream?
Well, you're putting too much into the question.
Maybe. What's it up to be? What does that mean? What does that mean? You tell me if I missed it.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I don't think it probably means that it asked the question, so I don't think it's how it means, but I don't think it had to do about marginalizing by not writing about.
It only works if I can go to William Steiner, well, maybe not William Steiner because he has done somebody major white and say, as a journalist,
Can you write about Black people?
That's right. Can I say that? What kind of question is that to put to Ed Doctorow, who has done it, by the way? If I can say, when are you going to write about Black people to a white writer, if that's a legitimate question to a white writer, then it is a legitimate question to me. I just don't think it is. The glove has to be pulled inside out.
So I usually play this on the first day of my class. Because I want the students to sort of ruminate on, what does it mean for Black folks to write about, the Black experience. I don't believe there's such a thing, but let's just, for the sake of, I had this student in my class raise his hand. He said, when are Black people going to get over it?
Oh.
No, actually, that's not what he said. He said, why can't Black people just get over it? Let me be accurate. Why can't Black people just get over it? Now, would we ask that question to a Jewish writer? Like, how come Jews can't? Y'all can't get over the Holocaust. That was decades ago. Now I let the question hang in the air until the end of the class. And then I said to him, Black people can't get over it because white people can't get over it. When y'all get over it, maybe we'll get over it. But right now, white supremacy tells us white people aren't over it. So, but I like this interview because part of what she's saying is that, and what she says later in the interview, I'm gonna play the whole thing, but it's on YouTube if you want to find it. She said, I have tried my entire career not to instantiate the white gaze in my books. Now think about that, right? Because what it means, as she describes, is that, when I read Melville or Faulkner or Henry James or F. Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway, and Black people happened to appear in those books, they were describing folks as if they weren't talking. They were talking to somebody over her shoulder, right? So if you ever read Hemingway, there's a short story called The Battler, where there's this Black man in the story, and the omniscient narrator is referring to the Black man's hands as nigger hands. Now, there's no reason to do it. It's gratuitous, but I think about one of my Black students reading that. What are we supposed to do with that? So part of where I want to sort of end is with just leaving you with the thought of what kind of conversations can we have? What kind of conversations does a novel like Beloved allow us to have that we wouldn't be able to have if the book didn't exist? Now, majority of people in here have read the book. And it's a book that is worth, I go back and reread it when I teach the class, at least parts of it. And then every once in a while I sit down and read the whole thing. It is a masterpiece. It is not my favorite Toni Morrison book. Song of Solomon holds that distinction. But it is a necessary book. And when we talk about people removing it from the curriculum, what does that mean? So we're at 1:00. So I want people those of you who have to go back to work, we'll go. But if there are any more questions, because I like to end on questions, and I like for people in the audience to have the last word. Is there anything that you want to leave us with? Yes, and then Ms. Bernita.
I tend to be a bit of opinionated, but I wanted to. I am a Black American who spent time in Africa, and I've been asked that question by my friends on the continent. Oh, why can't we, as Black Americans, get over slavery? And the way that I received the foundation of their question is not to harm us. It's actually in their minds they're thinking they're helping us, ease our pain, but not understanding our position and this is not something that we want to get over. We want to remember, we want to honor. So I think there is just a misunderstanding in how the question is posed from my friends on the continent. I don't think they have malice or any source of harm when they ask the question. I think that they want to, help us in that way, but not having us. And then the other point is, for me, as someone who's been privileged enough to travel to memorials on the continent, from again Senegal all the way to Badagry in Nigeria, I do think that having a physical place to grieve or having a formal grieving is not something that we as Black Americans have been able to do formally, or mass. Because like my grandmama would say, and I'm saying this in African American vernacular English, my grandmama would say, we're supposed to get on and keep moving, And so there's a strength that comes from continuing to endure instead of leaving and being present. And that's what going to those memorial sites, those slave ports and other sites on the continent did for me.
Ms. Bernita, you get the last one. I would just like to say thank you once again for this presentation. But I see not only Beloved, but all of her books as a form of the Bible. And like you get so many meanings and messages from it. And I would just encourage you, if you want to heal, Black, white, Puerto Rican, whatever, to push yourself beyond what your experience and what you have learned. There's so much more beyond Toni Morrison's books. And if we would all align ourselves with love, unity, harmony, maybe we could go beyond some of the hurt and pain that our ancestors and some of us still endure.
That's a great way to end. Thank you all. Thank you.